All right, so I got an update here for you guys on the Federal Reserve policy of basically trying to obliterate the working class and potentially plunge us into a recession so that our government doesn't have to touch the historic and record profits that corporate America is bringing in right now as they continue to price gouge the American people. So I got a couple different Common Dreams articles here in terms of what has happened over the last couple of days. As they point out here, obviously the Federal Reserve has announced once again that they are going to be raising those interest rates for the, I guess, fourth consecutive time at this point. And basically, they're going to get into some of the different arguments here and, why progressives are pushing back against this, why this makes no actual sense whatsoever in terms of meaningfully addressing inflation. But let's just go ahead and get into this here from Brett Wilkins. He says, progressive economists warn of catastrophic outcomes for workers as Fed hikes interest rates again. They say as the U.S. Federal Reserve on Wednesday raised interest rates, the fourth consecutive 0.75% increase and the sixth hike of the year. Okay, so I was wrong. It was the fourth consecutive, but the sixth hike of the year. Progressives stress that Fed policy boosts the likelihood of a global recession and disproportionately harms low-income workers and other marginalized people. So this is something that I haven't really touched on that much in discussing this. I've been sort of framing this from the domestic perspective of American workers, but the reason why they say this could cause not only a recession in the United States, but a global recession is, number one, obviously we are the global reserve currency, and basically if the United States economy goes to the shit, then that is obviously going to have reverberating effects around the world. But on top of that, us plunging ourselves into a recession or using this current Fed policy of hiking these interest rates in the short term, it basically strengthens the US dollar relative to a lot of other countries around the world, specifically countries that have U.S. currency denominated debts. That is going to make it that much more impossible for them as their currency is weakening against the U.S. dollar to actually make those debt payments, and is going to have catastrophic effects, again, not just for American workers, but for workers across the entire globe. So they continue saying that Fed Chair Jerome Powell explained that the move was necessary to ease inflation, complete bullshit, which has hit a 40-year high due to factors including corporate profiteering, which makes up the vast majority of it, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the climate emergency. We got a quote here. He said, "We've always said it was going to be difficult," he said. Okay, difficult for who? You're saying it's going to be difficult for average working class people, not so much difficult for corporate America. But he says, to the extent rates have to go higher and stay higher for longer, it becomes harder to see the path to avoiding a recession. He says, "I would say that the path has narrowed over the course of the last year." They say progressive economists and activists refuted the Fed's approach, and they have a quote here from Accountable.us spokesperson Liz Zelnick, who noted in a statement that, quote, "A chorus of economic experts have warned hiking interest rates again is a recipe for millions of Americans receiving pink slips," meaning being fired basically, "yet the Fed has decided to triple down on what is not working." And again, we haven't seen dramatic, lowering of inflation over the last couple of months or since the Federal Reserve decided to start imposing these interest rate hikes. And the logic behind it, which I'll get a little bit more specific here in a second, is just absolutely fucking insane. Not just because it's not going to work, but because you're just completely, going with an approach that is going to impose dramatic consequences on millions, tens of millions of people in the United States and around the world for something that is just going to be completely ineffective, right? You're basically deciding to put the burden of addressing inflation on the people at the bottom rung of the ladder in our economy, instead of going after the profits of the wealthiest billionaires and corporations in the country. So we have a quote here pushing back on this from the AFL-CIO, one of the largest union organizations in the country. They have a quote here saying, AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler said the Fed's latest rate hike will, quote, "have a direct and harmful impact on working people and our families and will not address the underlying causes of inflation." 100% true. She says the Fed seems determined to raise interest rates, though it openly admits that those rates could ruin our current economy as unemployment remains low and people are able to find jobs, she continued. A recession would instead cause companies to hire fewer people, making it harder for young workers, workers of color, and others who have greater barriers finding jobs, and put downward pressure on wages of all working people who will bear the brunt of an overactive monetary policy. And she finishes here saying, working people should not be the target of lowering inflation, Schuler added. It should be the corporations that are earning record profits. This is something that should be so fucking common sense that it shouldn't even need to be said. And yet, not only is the Federal Reserve choosing to go with this path, but the party in power right now, the Democrats, who basically allowed him to stay in this position. And keep in mind, this was a guy who was there under Donald Trump as well. Okay, this is not like some liberal or like progressive, economic guy. This is a guy who was basically a conservative on economics. And the Democrats are just letting him do this, right? As the economy and inflation are the single biggest issues issues going into these midterm elections. They're just letting him do whatever the fuck he wants and not touching the profits of the wealthiest corporations in the country. I mean, Joe Biden came out a couple of days ago, I covered it on this channel, tepidly saying he might or might not be in favor of doing something like a windfall profits tax. But it's like, you needed to do this months ago, and you need to aggressively be telling the Federal Reserve not to be doing this shit, right? We've heard some people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who have come out and said that this is an absolute disastrous monetary policy from the Fed. But Joe Biden, what has he said about it? I mean, he's just allowing him to double and triple and quadruple down on this same failed policy. And not only is it a failure from the Democratic Party, but it's also a failure from the media as well, our corporate media outlets that basically, again, completely overlook the main thing that is driving inflation right now. So again, here from Common Dreams, this one's from Jake Johnson. He says, Powell wasn't asked a single question about corporate profits driving inflation. Okay, so this was during his recent statements when he was announcing another interest rate hike. So they said that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell fielded questions for around 40 minutes on Wednesday following the central bank's decision to impose another large interest rate hike, but not a single reporter asked about the extent to which record high corporate profits are fueling inflation, even as companies openly boast about their pricing power. Okay, so I mean, literally we have a corporate media that is so ineffective in actually doing the job of a journalist and holding the most powerful people and institutions accountable in this country that they don't even ask the question. Okay, it's not even like they're not being aggressive enough, or they're not using the right sort of rhetoric on these things, or they don't fully understand it. They don't even fucking talk about it. Okay, how insane is that? Let's just sit on this for a minute. Okay, our entire media ecosystem, they had 40 minutes to ask this guy questions about his Fed policy, and not a single reporter asked a question about the single main cause that is driving inflation. What do you even say? I mean, it's like, of course, he's able to continue getting away with this. And, they have more information down here in terms of, what they actually were talking about and some of the defenses from Jerome Powell in terms of why he's deciding to go with this route. And it just gets absolutely wild seeing him lay this out in the open, what the actual priorities are right now and what the goal is with this current policy. So they say instead of asking those questions on the actual main driver of inflation, they say the Fed chair and reporters from corporate outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Fox Business, the Washington Post, the New York Times focused on workers' wages and the labor market, which Powell is explicitly trying to weaken. Again, we had this quote, U.S. Federal Reserve says its goal is to get wages down, right? As if wage growth, right? As if everybody has so much money in their pockets right now that it's gotten way out of control, right? He's actually saying we need to get wages down, as wages not only over the last 40 years haven't been keeping pace with productivity or inflation, but even just in this recent inflationary period, certainly have not been keeping pace with inflation. But his goal is to get wages down, as if that is going to somehow, reduce inflation in the long or the short term. It's completely fucking delusional. We got a quote here. He says, despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate at a 50-year low. He says this like it's a bad thing, okay? With the unemployment rate at a 50-year low and job vacancies still very high and wage growth elevated. Again, not elevated relative to inflation, right? So it's barely even keeping up with that. But he portrays this as if it's a bad thing that we have an extremely tight labor market with unemployment at a 50-year low, okay? Like that's a bad thing. Okay, I don't even know what the fuck to say to that. I mean, again, you have a situation right now. What he means by a tight labor market, by the way, is basically that workers have a tiny modicum of increased leverage in the current economic reality that we are living in. Now, who does that help? It helps workers. It gives them, again, more collective leverage because, bosses and corporations will be less likely to be able to fire them for no cause because it's less easy to go and get a replacement worker to take their spot, right? So he's basically saying that it is a bad thing that workers have a tiny amount of leverage in this tight labor market, which is really barely a tight labor market, in order to try to fight for, better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, more job security, right? He's saying that is a bad thing that not only is inherently bad, but needs to be addressed in a way where we can basically jack up the unemployment rate. And the justification here, the underlying premise of what he's trying to say here, and this is where it gets just completely insane, is that instead of having the legislative branch and Congress address inflation in a meaningful capacity by, number one, significantly investing in domestic manufacturing so that our supply chains aren't reliant on countries like China, and when you have a global pandemic, all of that gets completely fucked up, or any other factors that could disrupt our supply chain. You build domestically, you build that capacity here, and have a lot more redundancy added to our manufacturing base so that when stuff like a pandemic or any other disruption happens, we can deal with it without having those supply side, catastrophic consequences. That's That's number one. But number two, you do things like pass a windfall profits tax and then use that money to invest in average working class people so that you can lessen the burden of inflation and disincentivize a lot of these corporations from price gouging the American people, right? That's what you would actually need to do. And that needs to be done through Congress, right? The Fed doesn't have the policy toolkit to be able to address inflation right now. Okay, again, if it's primarily supply side breakdowns and it's primarily corporate price gouging, the Federal Reserve cannot address that. They do not have the ability to address that with their toolkit. All that they can do is crush demand. And so what they're actually doing here in crushing that demand is basically saying, instead of touching those corporate profits, instead of, having Congress invest in domestic manufacturing for the long-term solution to this, right? We are instead going to put the burden of lowering inflation on the poorest and most vulnerable people in the country. Okay, we are going to force potentially millions of people out of work so that, working class Americans get to such an abject, terrible state within their economic security that they will no longer be able to afford basic life necessities, and basically that demand plummeting would, I guess, in turn lower, lower the prices over the long run, or that, having some workers laid off would save corporations on labor costs, and that would somehow bring down the prices as well, which again completely overlooks the main drivers of inflation, right? So, I mean, it's just completely fucking insane that, number one, they're deploying this policy. Number two, Democrats are letting them deploy this policy. And number three, we have a corporate media ecosystem that isn't even either aware that this is going on, or they just don't simply give a shit that this is going on, right? They say, well, Powell, who has previously said one of his objectives, again, is to get wages down, conceded Wednesday. This is where it gets even more insane, okay? He conceded Wednesday that he doesn't see recent wage growth as the principal story of why prices are going up. No shit. He and other Fed officials continue to enact aggressive rate hikes that will ultimately have the effect of cutting wages and potentially throwing millions out of work. So, I mean, again, it's like most Americans don't even know why the Fed is doing what they're doing, or even what the Fed is actually doing right now. But, I mean, he just laid it out there explicitly for everybody. He's openly admitting that wage growths or labor costs are nowhere close to being the primary driver of inflation, and yet his entire monetary policy is centered around addressing that issue, right? His entire monetary policy, his goal, as he has openly stated multiple times, is to ramp up unemployment and to get wages down for average working class Americans. That's it, okay? This is not going to have an impact on inflation in any meaningful capacity whatsoever. So, I mean, listen, if you want to look at the midterms, the current state of the U.S. economy, why Republicans are somehow able to win on the economy, right? Even though they're just basically doing trickle-down economics for the 45th year in a row, right? This is why, okay? It's because Democrats, I mean, you had some, policies and, packages that were able to pass through the House and the Senate, and they, made tiny, fractional, like temporary improvements to the material conditions of average working class people. But if you're just letting the Federal Reserve push people, millions of people out of work, lower their wages, and potentially plunge us into a recession without even fucking talking about it, I mean, not only just not talking about it, but in many cases, like with Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the leadership class actively endorsing this policy, that it's like, what do you expect? Of course people don't trust you on the economy, and they honestly shouldn't. I mean, they shouldn't trust Republicans either, but you're basically just allowing the Federal Reserve and your overall monetary policy towards addressing inflation to be, we are not going to touch the profits of, these historic record level profits of the wealthiest corporations and billionaires in this country. We are instead going to basically allow this so-called independent Federal Reserve, right, which is supposed to be apolitical and independent, as if they don't just serve corporate America, right? We're seeing a perfect demonstration of whose interest they actually serve right now on full display, but you're just letting this situation play out, and then you turn around and wonder why you're about to get obliterated in these midterm elections. It's just completely fucking pathetic.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying